The air was thick with the scent of autumn as Prince Adrian strode into the forest. The weight of his crown heavier than the golden circlet he wore. The midnight sky above was an endless canvas of stars, but its beauty did little to soothe the storm within him. Whispers had carried tales of an enchantress who dwelled deep in these woods. Her magic, as dark as her promises, were alluring. Adrian, ever confident in his own charm, sought her out not to plead, but to test her. The moon hung low as he reached a clearing where the trees stood like sentinels. In the center of this circle, a figure awaited, draped in shadow and silver. The sorceress, taller than expected, her face shrouded beneath a veil of mist, turned her head as he approached. "You come here uninvited," she said, her voice lilting yet edged with iron. "What does the prince of this land desire so greatly that he risks treading upon sacred ground?" Adrian smirked, his pride lighting his features. "They call you the mistress of wishes," he said. "I have no desires that cannot be fulfilled by my own hand. But I wonder, can your magic truly bend fate? Or are you merely another storyteller in a kingdom of fools?" The air grew colder, the shadows at the edge of the clearing lengthening as if they hungered for him. The sorceress tilted her head, the faint glimmer of her eyes piercing the veil. "Fate does not bend, Prince Adrian. It twists, tangles, and ensnares. If you seek to mock what you cannot comprehend, then perhaps you should learn the cost of arrogance." Her hand, pale and long-fingered, rose slowly. Adrian's smirk faltered, a chill prickling at his skin, but his pride held him still. The sorceress whispered words that carried no meaning and every meaning at once. Her voice wove around him, a melody that tasted of iron and thunder. The curse struck like a thunderclap. Adrian staggered, his breath stolen as the world seemed to shift. His reflection faded into the void. His voice, once commanding, became hollow. The weight of the forest pressed upon him, and when he turned back toward the path, the castle in the distance seemed farther away than ever. "You are bound now," the sorceress said, her tone softer yet infinitely more dangerous. "Until you find what you mock, the truth of love, you will remain as you are, a shadow among the living. But be warned, Prince, time is cruel, and the clock waits for no one." Adrian turned, his pride now a distant echo in the hollow of his chest. "What must I do to break this curse?" The sorceress's veil shimmered in the moonlight as she stepped closer, her presence both magnetic and terrifying. "You will find her," she murmured, "your true love, hidden among the faces of the masquerade. Before the 12th chime of midnight, her kiss must be freely given. Fail, and your essence will be devoured by the void." With a flick of her wrist, the sorceress vanished, leaving the prince alone beneath the uncaring stars. The forest, once alive with whispers and unseen eyes, fell silent. Only the distant cry of an owl punctuated the stillness, a lament for the cursed. When Adrian returned to the castle, it was as though he had never existed. His name had faded from memory, his presence unnoticed by the servants who moved like phantoms in the hallways. Only the castle's grand clock remained a constant, a towering monolith in the ballroom, its pendulum a reminder of the time he had left. And so, the years began to pass, each masquerade a cruel reminder of his curse. Midnight after midnight, the chimes echoed unanswered, and the prince drifted through his kingdom, a ghost bound by the moonlight. Yet even as despair threatened to consume him, a sliver of hope clung to his soul, a hope that somewhere, among the countless masks, a spark of true love awaited. The ballroom of the castle was a place of perpetual splendor, its vaulted ceilings etched with constellations that seemed to shimmer with a light of their own. On the night of the annual masquerade, the air grew heavy with enchantment, drawing strangers and nobles alike into its gilded grip. No one questioned the invitations that arrived without a sender, nor the path that led them to the castle. It was as if the masquerade had a will of its own, plucking its guests from the fabric of the world. Prince Adrian stood at the edge of the gathering, his figure cloaked in the finest midnight blue, though none could see him. He was a shadow moving among a sea of faces, each one hidden behind ornate masks of feathers and gold. The music, ethereal and haunting, wove through the crowd like a spell, drawing them into a rhythm they could not resist. This night felt no different from the others. Adrian had walked this floor countless times, his invisible gaze scanning the crowd for a face that stirred something deeper than the curse's chains. Each year he had searched, and each year the 12th chime had come and gone, leaving him alone in a world that forgot his very existence. But tonight, the air carried a new undercurrent, one that prickled at the edges of his awareness. It began as a feeling, a pull, faint but insistent, leading his eyes toward a figure standing near the grand staircase. She was not like the others. Her mask was simple, a delicate frame of gossamer and pearls that did little to obscure her bright eyes, which roamed the room with a mix of wonder and trepidation. Her gown, though unadorned compared to the opulence around her, seemed to shimmer with a light of its own, as if it had captured the glow of the moon. Adrian felt his pulse quicken, a sensation he had not experienced since the curse had taken hold. As if drawn by an unseen force, he moved closer, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. The air around her seemed to hum, and for a fleeting moment he thought she might sense him. Her name came to him in a whisper, carried by the currents of magic that bound the masquerade. Evelyne. Evelyne's presence was magnetic yet fragile, like a flame flickering against the wind. She moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, her eyes searching, not for the grandeur of the ballroom, but for something deeper, something lost. Adrian followed her as she drifted toward the orchestra, her head tilting as if to listen for a melody only she could hear. He reached out instinctively, his hand hovering just above her shoulder before drawing back. What could he say to her? What could he offer? A prince unseen and forgotten, bound by a curse that devoured hope. And yet, as if sensing his despair, Evelyne turned. Her eyes did not meet his. How could they, when his form was hidden from her sight? But her gaze lingered in his direction, her brows furrowing slightly as though she felt the weight of his presence. "You," she murmured, so softly that it was nearly swallowed by the music. Adrian froze, his breath catching in his throat. Had she spoken to him? Or was it a trick of the Masquerade's enchantment? Before he could dwell on the thought, the orchestra struck a bold new chord, and the crowd began to part, swept into the tide of a grand waltz. Evelyne hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of her gown. It was clear she was unaccustomed to such gatherings, her posture betraying both awe and unease. Adrian watched as a masked lord approached her, his hand outstretched in a silent invitation to dance. She hesitated, then nodded, allowing herself to be led onto the floor. The sight twisted something deep within Adrian's chest, a mix of longing and fear. Time, he knew, was slipping away. As the waltz began, Adrian's focus narrowed, his attention solely on Evelyne. Each step she took seemed to draw him further into her orbit, the crowd fading into nothingness. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he had long since buried. Hope. The clock's pendulum swung, its quiet ticking a reminder of the stakes. Midnight would come, as it always did, and with it, the 12th chime. But for the first time, Adrian felt that perhaps this night would end differently. And so, he stepped forward, invisible yet determined, weaving through the sea of masks toward the one light in the Masquerade's endless shadows. The castle beneath the Masquerade was a labyrinth few dared to tread. Its passages twisted like the veins of an ancient tree, and the deeper one ventured, the heavier the air became, as though the stones themselves were alive with secrets. Adrian moved through the shadowed halls with practiced precision, the faint echoes of the ballroom's music fading behind him. Tonight, he could not afford hesitation. The name of the clockmaker whispered in his thoughts like a distant toll, its weight heavy with urgency. The clockmaker was more myth than man, a figure tied to the very heartbeat of the castle. Some said he had crafted the grand timepiece in the ballroom, binding its mechanisms to the fabric of magic itself. Others whispered that he had been trapped here for centuries, tending to the clock that governed the prince's curse. If there were answers to be found, they lay with him. The air grew colder as Adrian descended, the golden sconces flickering with a ghostly light. At last he reached a door that seemed to breathe, a heavy iron thing adorned with intricate carvings of gears and constellations. As Adrian raised his hand to knock, the door groaned open on its own, revealing a chamber steeped in twilight. The room was vast yet intimate, its walls lined with shelves overflowing with ancient tomes and broken timepieces. In the center stood the clockmaker, a gaunt figure hunched over a table where gears and springs lay scattered like puzzle pieces. His hands moved with inhuman precision, the faint glow of enchantment emanating from his fingertips. "I wondered when you would come," the clockmaker said without turning, his voice rasping like wind through dry leaves. "Time grows impatient with you, Prince Adrian." Adrian stepped forward, his heart heavy with the weight of his failure. "The curse binds me tighter with each passing masquerade," he said. "But tonight, I felt something, a presence, a light." The clockmaker turned, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Only his eyes were visible, pale and unblinking, like moons caught in eternal eclipse. "The girl," he said, his tone neither a question nor a confirmation. "She stirs the clock, but it is not enough. What must I do?" Adrian's voice cracked with desperation. "If she is the one, why does the curse still hold me? Midnight approaches and The clockmaker interrupted, gesturing toward a smaller replica of the ballroom's grand timepiece, "is more than a keeper of hours. It measures not only time but intent. The 12th chime will only sound if her heart carries the weight of true love." Adrian's breath hitched. "True love. How can I make her feel something so profound in so little time?" "You misunderstand," the clockmaker said, his pale eyes narrowing. "True love cannot be forced, nor can it be born of desperation. It must be freely given, a spark that ignites in both your hearts. But be warned, the spark must find her before the 12th chime, or your essence will fade into nothing." The words settled over Adrian like a shroud, their truth undeniable. He felt the pull of time in every fibre of his being, a cruel reminder of the stakes. "And if she does not feel it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The clockmaker's gaze was unyielding. "Then you will remain a shadow, forever unseen, until the clock claims you." Adrian nodded, though his thoughts churned with fear and determination. As he turned to leave, the clockmaker's voice stopped him. "Remember this, Prince," he said, his tone sharp with meaning. "True love is not born of magic or destiny. It is fragile, unpredictable, and human. If you seek to win her heart, do so not as a prince bound by a curse, but as a man with everything to lose." The words echoed in Adrian's mind as he ascended the steps, the weight of the clockmaker's wisdom pressing upon him. The ballroom's music grew louder with each step, pulling him back into the masquerade's shimmering grasp. He had no plan, no certainty, only the fragile hope that Evelyne's light might lead them both to salvation. The pendulum of the grand clock swung in perfect rhythm, its measured ticks a countdown to fate. And as Adrian re-entered the sea of masks, his resolve burned brighter than ever, a flickering flame against the shadows of time. The ballroom shimmered with an otherworldly light as Adrian stepped back into its embrace. The music swirled through the air, pulling the masked revelers into a waltz that seemed to transcend time. He stood at the edge of the grand hall, his eyes fixed on Evelyne, who stood near the orchestra, her hands lightly clasped as she gazed out at the sea of dancers. The air around her seemed different now, charged with the same fragile hope that had stirred within him. She was not like the others, her movements hesitant, her eyes searching, as if she too felt the weight of something unseen. Adrian could feel the pull between them growing stronger, as if the curse itself had tethered them together. Gathering his courage, he moved closer, weaving through the crowd with a purpose that felt both foreign and natural. He could not touch her, could not speak directly, but the intensity of his presence seemed to draw her gaze. As her eyes scanned the room, they paused, lingering in his direction. Though she could not see him, she shivered as if caught in a sudden breeze. Then the music shifted, a haunting melody unfurling from the strings of the orchestra. The dancers slowed, their steps faltering as the waltz gave way to something softer, more intimate. A voice rang out, a call for a lover's dance beneath the moonlight. Evelyne hesitated as the crowd around her dispersed, forming pairs that moved toward the open terrace bathed in silver light. Her uncertainty was palpable, but before she could retreat into the shadows, Adrian made his move. Though unseen, he extended his hand in silent invitation, his longing reaching out to her like an unspoken vow. Evelyne blinked, her expression unreadable, yet her feet carried her forward, as if drawn by a force she could not name. The terrace was empty save for the two of them, the soft hum of the masquerade fading behind. Adrian stepped closer, positioning himself in front of her. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing as though she sensed a presence, even if she could not fully grasp it. Slowly he lifted his arms, mimicking the gestures of a waltz, and as if in response, Evelyne raised her hands, placing them in the space where his should be. A breath caught in her throat as she began to move, her steps aligning with his in perfect harmony. The dance was slow, almost hesitant, but as they moved beneath the light of the moon, something unspoken passed between them, a connection that transcended words and form. Evelyne's eyes glistened with emotion, and Adrian felt the warmth of her presence, a balm to the emptiness that had plagued him for years. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I can't see you, but I feel you." Adrian longed to answer, to tell her everything, but the curse bound his voice, silencing him as the clock's pendulum ticked ever onward. Instead, he guided her through the dance, his steps speaking the truths his lips could not. He poured his soul into the movement, showing her not the prince cursed by arrogance, but the man who had come to understand his heart. Evelyne's expression softened, a faint smile gracing her lips as the walls of her guarded heart began to crumble. "It's strange," she murmured. "I came here tonight searching for something. I didn't even know what it was, but now..." Her voice trailed off, her eyes lifting to meet his unseen gaze. "Now I think I found it." The music swelled, reaching a crescendo that mirrored the pounding of Adrian's heart. For the first time since the curse had taken hold, he felt truly seen, not as a shadow, but as a man standing at the edge of salvation. The clock in the ballroom began to chime, its low, resonant toll signaling the approach of midnight. Evelyne tensed, her eyes darting toward the sound, but Adrian held her steady, his movements imploring her to stay in the moment. 1 chime, 2, 3. The world seemed to narrow around them, the terrace bathed in an ethereal glow. Evelyne closed her eyes, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Adrian leaned closer, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. 4 chimes, 5. The air grew electric, heavy with the weight of possibility. Evelyne's breath quickened, her hands tightening in the empty space where his should have been. 6, 7. Adrian could feel the clock's urgency clawing at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing only on her. The spark of hope he had felt earlier burned brighter now, a flame refusing to be extinguished. 8, 9. Evelyne opened her eyes, and in them, Adrian saw not fear but trust. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Whoever you are, I believe in you." 10, 11. The final chime hung in the air, the world poised on the edge of eternity. Adrian leaned forward, his heart pounding as he prepared for the moment that would decide his fate. The 12th chime began to toll, a sound both thunderous and fragile, echoing through the ballroom and across the terrace. Time seemed to splinter, each second stretching into eternity as the world held its breath. Prince Adrian stood inches from Evelyne, her face illuminated by the silver glow of the moon. His heart raced with a mixture of desperation and hope, every fibre of his being yearning for the spell to break. Evelyne's eyes widened, her breath shallow as she leaned forward, drawn by a pull she did not understand. Though she could not see him, her heart seemed to recognize the truth of his presence, as though the veil of the masquerade was lifting just for her. The night's enchantment danced in the air between them, fragile and electric, like a thread woven from the fabric of dreams. The 12th chime hung in the air, trembling with unspoken power. Adrian moved closer, his invisible hand brushing the edge of her face, his lips a whisper away from hers. He closed his eyes, his silent plea echoing in his mind. Let this be enough. As their lips met, the world around them dissolved into a cascade of light and shadow. Evelyne gasped, her hands instinctively reaching for something solid as the emptiness where Adrian had been transformed into warmth. Her fingers found his shoulders, her touch breaking the barrier that had kept him hidden for so long. Adrian pulled back slightly, his breath mingling with hers as their gazes locked. For the first time she saw him, not as a phantom or a shadow, but as a man with eyes filled with vulnerability and a soul laid bare. Her expression shifted from wonder to recognition, a single tear sliding down her cheek as if a memory long buried had surfaced. You, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've seen you before, in my dreams. Adrian's heart swelled, the curse's weight lifting as the magic that bound him unraveled. The castle around them shimmered, the masquerade spell dissolving into the night. Masks fell from faces, revealing guests who stood dazed, as if waking from a long slumber. The grand clock in the ballroom let out a final resounding chime before falling silent, its pendulum still for the first time in centuries. The air grew still, the quiet charged with meaning. Evelyne stepped back, her hands trembling as she took in the man before her. Who are you? She asked, her voice soft yet steady. Adrian hesitated, his throat tightening with emotion. I am a man who once lost himself to arrogance, he said, his voice raw but sincere. A man who wandered in darkness until your light showed me the way. Her lips parted, a question lingering in her eyes. But before she could speak, the glow of the castle intensified. The walls, once grand but hollow, now radiated life, their grandeur restored by the breaking of the curse. The ballroom's chandeliers blazed with brilliance, their crystals refracting the light into 1,000 rainbows. The guests, now free from the masquerade's spell, began to stir, their murmurs rising as they looked around in awe. But Adrian and Evelyne stood apart, the world around them fading into insignificance. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. I don't understand, she murmured. Why me? Because you saw me, Adrian said, his voice steady now. Not as a prince or a shadow, but as a man. And in doing so, you reminded me of what it means to truly feel alive. Her gaze softened, her lips curving into a hesitant smile. And now? What happens now? Adrian's smile mirrored hers, tentative but growing with each passing second. Now, he said, we begin again. Not as a curse to be broken, but as two people searching for what lies beyond the story. Evelyne nodded, her fingers intertwining with his. Around them, the guests began to leave, drawn away by the unseen forces that had brought them here. The castle, once so heavy with enchantment, now felt light, as though it too had been freed. As the moonlight faded into dawn, Adrian and Evelyne stepped out onto the castle's balcony, their hands still entwined. The first rays of sunlight bathed the world in gold, a promise of new beginnings. And as they stood together, the weight of the curse nothing more than a distant memory, they knew that the dance of destiny had led them not to an ending, but to a chance at something more. A love born of choice, fragile yet infinite.